Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to share with you the official figures that have been published by the Ministry of Finance of Russia on what's happening in the Russian economy. So we're going to have a look at what's happening with oil and gas revenues, and I can tell you that the income is down more than 63% against the equivalent figures for 2021, which was the last year that had no impact of the sanctions, so prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll also have a look at what's been happening with non-oil and gas revenues, because bizarrely, they are up significantly. In fact, they're up so much that it's almost offset the fall in oil and gas revenue. So the Russian economy, according to the figures coming out from the Ministry of Finance of Russia, is actually changing away from being dependent on oil and gas and is now generating a lot more revenue from other sources. So we'll go through that in some detail. We'll then have a look at what's happening with expenditure, and not surprisingly, it's up against 22 and 23 as Russia continues to invest into the war in Ukraine. We'll then have a look at what the net impact is in terms of whether Russia is reporting a net profit or a net loss. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is going on in the Russian economy and what's likely to happen in December, which is a critical month because Russia historically has passed a huge amount of expenditure. It seems to be a clear out month. So we'll talk about what could happen for the year end. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that supported the channel. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Okay, so if you follow the channel, you'll be aware by now that the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation publish information on their website on a monthly basis. And if you want to check it out yourself, you can go to minfin.gov.ru/en if you're looking to read it in English. And on the 12th of December, they published the detailed figures for the Russian economy in a document entitled Brief Monthly Information on Federal Budget Execution Cumulative from the Beginning of the Year in billions of rubles. And this is what that document looks like. It gives us a breakdown of the oil and gas revenues and the non-oil and gas revenues. It also provides us with some details on things like VAT and tax, and also expenditure. But unfortunately, the Russian authorities have stopped giving us a breakdown of what the expenditure is actually being invested into, so I'm not able to drill down into that detail for you. And what I've done, I've transposed all of these figures into a separate spreadsheet, and rather than talking about figures, I've put them onto a graph because I think graphs give us a much better visual explanation as to what's happening. This graph shows the cumulative revenue that Russia has earned from oil and gas sales for 2021, 2022 and 2023. 2021 is shown by the grey line at the top of the graph, 22 is shown by the orange line in the middle of the graph, and 23 is shown by the blue line, which is at the bottom. And what I've done with this chart is annotated it, so I've actually put the figures onto the graph, and these figures are shown in billions of rubles. So before we dive into the detail on what's happened in November, the obvious thing that stands out from this graph is that the revenue in 2022, shown by the orange line, was significantly lower than it was in 2021, and the income in 2023 was lower than it was in 2022 and materially lower than 2021. And if you look at the shape of the orange line, which plots the income for 2022, you can see that there's a clear divergence between the grey and the orange lines in April, which was as a direct result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which started on the 24th of February, but started having an impact on revenue as the sanctions started to be applied against Russia from April onwards. If we now focus in on the results for November, which are the latest figures that have been published by the Ministry of Finance in Russia, you can see that total revenue for the 11 months to November 23 is 8.2 trillion rubles, which is roughly around $90 billion at the current exchange rate of around 90 rubles to $1. And this income figure is around 2.4 trillion rubles less than Russia earned in the same period in 2022, which represents a reduction in income of around 23%. However, when you compare the figure of 8.2 trillion to what Russia achieved in 2021, which was before any impact of the sanctions, it represents a shortfall of 14.2 trillion rubles, or around 63%. And that is a huge reduction in income for a country that is entirely dependent on oil and gas revenues. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, these are the official figures being published by the Ministry of Finance from Russia. And they prove that oil and gas revenue is down significantly against where Russia was before it commenced its invasion of Ukraine. Now, in addition to the absolute fall in Russian ruble revenue, another really interesting piece of analysis to look at is what the impact is in terms of the net value of the Russian rubles being received. So this takes into account the fall in the value of the ruble. And this chart shows the movement in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble over the last 5 years. And what this shows is that currently one US dollar is trading for around 90 Russian rubles. However, 12 months ago in November 2022, one US dollar was trading for around 60 Russian rubles, and in November 21, it was trading for around 72 rubles. And just before I go on to talk about what the impact of this is for the Russian economy, I wanted to quickly have a look at what's been happening with the exchange rate between the Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan and also the Indian rupee. Because you may be sitting there thinking, well, is the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble relevant to Russia anymore because they're not doing a lot of business with America? But if we look at what's happened with the Chinese yuan, you can see that it has exactly the same shape as what we just looked at for the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble, and the Indian rupee shape is also identical. So what this tells us is that the movements in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble are representative of what's been happening in the international markets. The Russian ruble has significantly deteriorated in value against almost every currency in the world. So what that means from Russia's perspective is that the Russian ruble now has less purchasing power in the international markets. So imports are relatively more expensive, and that's one of the things that's driving up inflation in the Russian economy right now. And in terms of what the movement in the exchange rate has done to the relative purchasing power of the sale of Russian oil, this table shows Russia's oil and gas revenues for the 11 months to November 23, 22 and 21. And these are the figures that we've just talked through: 8.2 trillion rubles for this year, 10.7 trillion rubles for 22, and 22.4 trillion rubles for 2021. And on the right-hand side of this table, you can see what the US dollar equivalent is of all of those revenue figures, taking account of the relevant exchange rate at that time. So in November 2021, the 22.4 trillion rubles of income that Russia earned in those 11 months equated to 311 billion US dollars. In the 11 months to November 22, total income fell to 10.7 trillion rubles, and the US dollar equivalent was $177 billion, which represents a fall of around $134 billion in purchasing power, or around 43%. And in the 11 months to November 23, Russia's 8.2 trillion rubles of income equates to around $91 billion. So you can see that over the last 2 years, the US dollar equivalent of Russia's oil and gas revenue has fallen from around $312 billion to $91 billion, which represents a fall of around 71%. And as Russia is still importing lots of goods, it's having to buy things in the international markets, its purchasing power has fallen significantly. And this is one of the reasons why the Russian economy is struggling right now. This chart plots Russia's non-oil and gas revenue over the last 3 years. And interestingly here, we've got a complete reversal of the situation that we just looked at for oil and gas revenue. The figures for 2023 are shown by the blue line, which are the highest out of all of the 3 years. The figures for 2022 are shown by the orange line, which are the second highest. And the figures for 2021 are shown by the grey line, which is at the bottom of this chart. And as I've discussed in previous videos, the only logic behind the huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue in 22 and 23 is the militarization of the Russian economy. Russia has taken a conscious decision to keep supplying military equipment and ammunition to the war in Ukraine. And as a result of this, a lot of companies have changed what they're doing, and this is driving a lot of income in the economy. If we look at the figures for the 11 months to November 23, you can see that total non-oil and gas revenue was 17.7 trillion rubles, which interestingly means that non-oil and gas revenue is now more than double the oil and gas revenue. So what these official figures from Russia are telling us is that Russia is no longer dependent on oil and gas and is generating 2/3 of its income from other sources. The 17.7 trillion rubles for 2023 represents an increase of more than 25% against the equivalent figure from 2022 and is more than double the 8.2 trillion rubles that Russia earned from non-oil and gas revenue in 2021. And in terms of putting that income into perspective, it equates to around $200 billion. This chart shows Russia's total revenue, so the combination of oil and gas revenue and non-oil and gas revenue for the past 3 years. And as you can see from the chart, 2021 remains the year that Russia earned the most total revenue. However, interestingly, in the 11 months to November, 2023 has now overtaken 2022 in terms of total revenue. So it's the second best year out of the last 3 from Russia's perspective. If we look at the figures for the 11 months to November 23, Russia earned total revenue of 26 trillion rubles, which in US dollar terms is around $290 billion. The 2023 figures represent an increase of around 4.8% against the 24.8 trillion rubles that Russia earned in the 11 months to November 22. However, the latest figures represent a fall of around 16% against the 30.6 trillion rubles earned in the first 11 months of 2021. And the overall summary with regards to the situation on total revenue is that the huge shortfall that Russia has experienced in oil and gas sales in 2023 has been largely offset by a huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue, which has been driven primarily as a result of Russia moving towards being a wartime economy. This chart shows the movement in Russia's total expenditure over the last 3 years, and what this chart shows is that despite the fact that oil and gas revenue and total revenue has fallen, Russian expenditure has increased in both 2022 and also in 2023. Total expenditure in the first 11 months of 2023 equated to 26.8 trillion rubles, which is around $300 billion. And that figure represents an increase of around 12% against the equivalent figure from 2022, and an uplift of around 35% against the expenditure from 2021. And one of the things that's interesting to note about the graphs for both 2021 and 2022 is that there was a sharp increase in total expenditure in both years in the final month of the year. You can see that there's a kink in the line, there's a distinct upward trend for the last month. And the reason for that is that Russia is passing a lot of expenditure in the final month of the calendar year. And whilst we don't have the figures yet for December, it's extremely likely that Russia will follow exactly the same trend, and we will see a sharp uptick in December 2023, and total expenditure is likely to come in significantly higher than 30 trillion rubles. And it'll be interesting once those figures are officially posted to see exactly how much expenditure is passed in the final month of this year. This graph shows the net position for the Russian economy over the last 3 years. If we have a look at the grey line first, you can see that in every single month in 2021, Russia posted a net profit, and the net profit for the 11 months to November 2021 was 10.7 trillion rubles, which, taking account of the exchange rate at that time of around $1 to 72 rubles, equated to around 150 billion US dollars. Now, interestingly, when you look at the orange line, which shows the figures for 2022, Russia also posted a net profit in every single month. However, that net profit did start coming down from May onwards. We saw an increase in the first 5 months of 2022, and that was as a result of the fact that oil prices spiked all around the world. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw oil prices go significantly above $100 per barrel. And even though Russia was having to sell a lot of its oil at a discount, it was still achieving a good net price for the oil that it was selling, and therefore was making a net profit. However, in the second half of 2022, there were a number of things that impacted on Russia's income. Firstly, the price of oil in the international market started falling as a result of a global slowdown. Secondly, the sanctions started to kick in, so Russia found it more difficult to find buyers for its oil. And thirdly, Russia had to start offering larger discounts to encourage countries such as India and China to take large quantities. So all of that had a negative impact on Russia's income. And by November 2022, Russia's net profit was down to 743 billion rubles, which at the prevailing exchange rate of around $1 to 60 Russian rubles at that time equated to around $12 billion. However, as a result of what we just discussed with regards to expenditure, whereby Russia puts through a huge amount of expenditure in the final month of the year, you can see that the year-end position for December 2022 was actually a net deficit of 3.3 trillion rubles. If we now look at the situation for 2023, you can see that Russia has posted a net deficit in every single one of the first 11 months of the year, and the cumulative net deficit of 879 billion rubles equates at the current exchange rate to around $10 billion. However, it's extremely likely that this net deficit will increase significantly in December when Russia passes through its year-end expenditure charges. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the official figures that are published by the Ministry of Finance are really important. We have a severe lack of official data available to us, so we can't do the same level of analysis that we can do on other countries. So anything that's signed off by the Kremlin, that's officially published for the rest of the world to review, is really important. And what we've seen in today's figures is that the oil and gas revenue for the first 11 months of 2023 are down significantly against where they were in 2022, but they are down massively, 63% against where Russia was in 2021. So anybody that says that Russia has been unaffected by the sanctions hasn't seen these figures, because a fall of 63%, which is almost 2/3, is huge. If this was a company reporting its figures and it was saying that it was down 63%, you would want the chief executive and the rest of the board to explain to you exactly what had been happening, because it's likely that that company today would be worth only around 1/3 of what it was worth 2 years ago. And I think that really puts into perspective how severe the impact on the Russian economy has been. Now, interestingly, over the same period of time, non-oil and gas revenue has more than doubled, and in fact has almost offset the fall in oil and gas revenue. Now, as we discussed earlier in the video, one of the main drivers for that is that Russia has now repositioned itself as a wartime economy. There is a big effort going into keeping supplies going for Ukraine. And what this tells us is that over the last 2 years, there's been a sea change in the Russian economy. It's no longer dependent on oil and gas. That only represents around 1/3 of Russia's total revenue. It's now dependent on the war in Ukraine, which seems like a perverse thing to say, but that's the way the Russian economy has been repositioned. There is a lot of expenditure going into keeping that war going, and that's keeping total revenue up. And as a result of that increase in expenditure, in every single month of 2023, Russia has posted a net deficit, and this compares to a huge profit that Russia was posting in every single month in 2021. So anybody that doesn't think that there's been any impact on Russia of the sanctions hasn't seen these figures, and these are the official figures. I have to keep saying it because I get a lot of comments below from people saying you're talking rubbish, you're making all of this up, it's just nonsense. Russia's actually doing better today than it was before it invaded Ukraine. Well, if it is, that isn't being represented in the figures that are being published by the Kremlin. And today's video is all about analysing those official figures. And the official figures tell us that oil and gas revenue is down 63% compared to where it was in 2021. Russia has managed to bolster its total revenue by investing lots of effort and money into the war in Ukraine. That's driven up its expenditure, and that's causing Russia to post net deficits. Those net deficits are being funded by the National Wealth Fund, and as I've discussed many times before, the National Wealth Fund is a finite amount of money, and if Russia continues to keep posting net deficits, it will continue draining that National Wealth Fund, and at some point it will run out of cash. And as we discussed earlier in the video, in 2021 and 2022, Russia posted an enormous expenditure figure. It clears out all of the costs in the final month of the year, and it will be fascinating to see, once those official figures are published, how much comes through for December 2023 and what the size of the net deficit for this year ends up being. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.